Hello everybody and welcome to this month's Focus on Local History. In April we celebrate Library Week, so it seemed like the appropriate time to talk about the library. And actually we're going to be talking about the old library, the Carnegie building, which I think most people in town are familiar with. We can trace its roots back to 1899 when a group of concerned citizens began donating books to a public reading room. The very first book was loaned out on November 25th, 1899. So if there's a birth date to Kaukauna Library, that's probably it. This was run by the local women's group, but they weren't so happy with the library. They were happy they made one, but the problem was the reading room was on top of the local jail. And at that point in time, the primary use of the jail was a place to put people who were too drunk to go home and they needed to sober up. Not exactly the place you want nice quiet reading, lots of noisiness going on through the walls, so not ideal. They formed the Kaukauna Library Board. There were a number of influential people on the board. There were three former mayors, Dr. H.B. Tanner, Peter Reuter, and J.H. Mulholland. And there were some industrial giants on there as well, Oscar Tilmany and Norman Brokaw. Around 1901, 1902, Dr. Tanner is writing multiple letters urging Andrew Carnegie to consider Kaukauna for a donation. In December 1902, a blank form arrived from Carnegie's office asking for information on what they wanted to build. And I should stop here and clarify. I say Carnegie. I know technically his name is Carnegie, but nobody says that. So I'm just going to say Carnegie. 1 week after returning the form, just 1 week, an offer arrived from the private secretary of Andrew Carnegie. He would agree to furnish $10,000 for the construction of the library so long as Kaukauna provided the land. And $10,000 in this time is pretty good money. The library board of directors liked the offer. They decided to put the matter before the Common Council because they would have the final say. They found the offer to be very fair. The Kaukauna Times also urged the city to act, suggesting that such an opportunity may never come again. They pointed out that at the very exact same time that Kaukauna got an offer, 5 other local cities had also gotten offers. In fact, Manitowoc was offered as much as $25,000 for their library. Within the week, the Common Council approved, and they were looking for placement. There was some discussion over where it would go, but ultimately they decided on putting it on the island. Why did they choose the island? A number of reasons, but the number one reason is that at the time, the north side and the south side didn't necessarily get along. They saw themselves as two separate entities. Even if you look on old records, even after Kaukauna was joined, people would write North Kaukauna or South Kaukauna. They didn't even want to say Kaukauna. They wanted to identify which side they were from. So putting the library on the island was sort of seen as a reconciliation because if you put it on one side, the other side might get upset. So that was kind of the reason for that. At about the same time the Kaukauna Library is being built, Carnegie gives a speech in Washington, D.C. with President Roosevelt. I'm not going to read this whole speech, but he basically goes through and he explains that at this point in his life, he's decided that he's retired from business and he's ready to give back, and the most important thing he can think to give back is libraries. So he's going around the country, and in fact around a lot of the world, and building libraries. I mean, he's building hundreds and hundreds of libraries. And he says that he doesn't even think of this as charity. He thinks of this as democracy because it's giving people an equal say, an equal voice, equal education. He even says in front of President Roosevelt, he goes, if President Roosevelt walks into the library, he has no more rights to the items in a library than the lowest citizen among you. He goes, so it's about the most equal opportunity place you can imagine, which I think is a sentiment that holds true today. I mean, that's kind of why we're here. If you need something and you don't want to have to spend your own money, come to the library. We're happy to provide. So yeah, this goes on for some time, and eventually things work out. The land ends up being donated by the Green Bay, Mississippi Canal Company, and the library is built, opening up in 1905. So it takes a little over a year to actually get this up and running, but it goes. The Kaukauna Library, I'm sad to say, is not strictly original. Not only were there many offers to build libraries around the state and the country, but the blueprints that were used for the Kaukauna Library were a carbon copy of one that was already built in Richland Center the year before. So it's kind of like a replica of a previous library, but no less great. Still a fantastic library. Architects Claude and Stark were hired, and they came in and they were able to build it. They did minor modifications with some influence from what was called the Craftsman's Movement. I am not an architect. I do not know what that means, but the original librarian was Lillian Bell, and she had one assistant, Marion Kelly. Lillian Bell was one of the Bell sisters, fantastic family. One of the sisters was the head nurse at Philmany at the time. You needed a nurse on staff because people were getting injured all the time. The Bell sisters lived on Greenough Street, and they deserve their own program. They're fantastic. In 1915, the annual circulation, and this is unbelievably low, the annual circulation was 1,789 books and 24 magazines. The total number of people who used the library was 515. Pretty sure we've broken that in a day. So big change in the last 100 years there. The Carnegie Corporation continued its mission for many years. During World War I, they made a donation of $320,000 to construct mobile libraries in France and other places in Europe so American soldiers could have access to libraries, even on the battlefield, which is pretty great. This apparently was a pretty common thing. There were also mobile YMCAs, Red Crosses, Knights of Columbus stations going up and down throughout France. And the library ultimately had an unintended influence on the city planning because it was the building on the island that sort of brought the two sides together. It started a trend. Slowly but surely, City Hall moves to the island in 1921. The high school moves there in 1923. The post office moves there in 1935. So one by one, all the important government buildings in town moved to the island. Some have since moved away, but it was really important in those days to get everybody to have a common meeting place. The library was a big deal for a long, long time, and it still is, but it was such a big deal that even the local newspaper would report on the newest titles that the library got. It's sort of amusing looking through the old newspapers and saying, this month's new accumulations are this, and they'll list off all the new books that are in the library. I don't know when they stopped doing that, but I always find that amusing to see what was coming in. And this continued on for a long, long time. The library ultimately did get an addition in 1976. The plus and the minus of this is the plus is it was much needed. At that point, the population was so large that the small original building, which was essentially the old children's department and nothing more, that really wasn't big enough. But the bad part of that is by adding on the addition, they disqualified themselves from being part of the National Historic Register because it was no longer original. And that building continued on for another 25, 30 years or so until we got to the building we have here today. And the Carnegie building ultimately had to be abandoned again for size issues. And we are now in the wonderful Eagle Mill, which, I know some people are sad that the Carnegie building was abandoned by the library. But on the plus side, the Eagle Mill, just as historic, in fact, possibly more historic. It dates back to 1872, even older than the Carnegie building. And as of just this past month, we received news that the Carnegie building is being remodeled to use as apartments. And they're keeping the outside structure and everything. So it will continue to keep the original architecture as much as possible. So it does live on. If you've listened this far, and you're still interested in more, our good friend Carol Van Boxel actually wrote a little book on the history of the library in town, so there's plenty more in here. We also have a number of things on file. We do have the original correspondence that was written between Carnegie and Dr. Tanner, so that's here. We did have a large number of blueprints of the Carnegie building. We sent them down to City Hall a while back. I don't know if we ever got them back yet or not, but they are technically here. And just a variety of other things. Obviously, being the library, we're going to have library materials. So if there's something you're interested in learning a little bit more about the building or its history, come on down. I'm happy to share it with you. But otherwise, that's this month's Focus on Local History. Thank you.